StarTropics is a game that usually gets a lot of love from longtime Nintendo fans. They remember it as a fun Zelda clone with a solid soundtrack and decent graphics. Detractors of the game remember this as a cryptic mess that required Nintendo power, much like Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link, or Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. I have relatively fond memories of this as a kid, but admittedly got stuck at several points without having access to the internet because I'm too old and it didn't exist back then. StarTropics was developed and published by Nintendo and released in late 1990 in North America, and apparently never in Japan, which is pretty crazy to me. I can't find records of it being released on the Wii or DS stores either, but I'm assuming it's made its way over there at some point. It follows the story of Mike Jones, a teenager whom is on vacation to visit his uncle. However, once he gets to his uncle's island, he discovers that he's been abducted by aliens and goes on an adventure to find him. Armed with the trusty yo-yo, you traverse through islands, dungeons, whales, and more, defeating enemy and foe along the way. The gameplay here is going to remind you directly of The Legend of Zelda, but with some added janky elements. For one, movement does not flow as well as Zelda. It's hard to explain, but in Zelda you can easily move from left, right, up, down without any feeling of resistance. In StarTropics, there's always a weird latency to movement. It kind of feels like Mike needs to literally turn his body to move. Some people might like this, but personally I feel it's kind of horrible. There's also a jump for clearing platforms and jumping on switches, but again, it feels slow and laggy and generally just gets you killed if you use it in combat. Later in the game though, you need to use jump attacks to hurt the bosses, which is a whole nother level of annoying sometimes. There are special items you can find in most of the dungeons, such as a baseball bat, a freeze attack, and a laser gun. The only thing that sucks is when you use these, you mostly have to save them to use on the bosses, which means you'll just be using that yo-yo 99% of the time. Speaking of the yo-yo, once you have enough hearts, it powers up. The problem here though is that 1 or 2 hits from an enemy will take away that power up, and there's a serious lack of hearts dropped by enemies. In your first playthrough, I'd expect you to rarely be able to keep your yo-yo power-ups. The open world is quasi-RPG. You can walk around and talk to people to advance the story, but there's no currency or items to buy. The characters are all pretty fleshed out and look great though. There are always new areas to explore, but generally to advance the story, you'll complete fetch quests for an NPC who needs an item that's hidden away in a dungeon, blocked off by a boss monster. I mean, it's pretty standard stuff, but the tone of the game is super uplifting, so it never gets annoying or feels repetitive. The majority of the actual gameplay is held in dungeons, and here's where a guide is often helpful to finish. These dungeons focus on both battles and puzzles, but it really doesn't excel at either. The monsters move a little erratically and can be super annoying to battle given the stiff combat movement. Once you get the hang of it, you kind of just adjust to its crap factor. The puzzles range from anything like destroying the correct monster, jumping on switches, finding hidden switches, and the worst is finding false walls. Unlike Zelda, where you can use a dungeon map or find cracked walls to bomb, there are no built-in maps or obvious wall cracks in StarTropics until super late in the game. Several dungeons have walls that you can break with the yo-yo, but the only one I found was in the very last alien ship, which is almost completely necessary to find, as it gives you so many power-ups that are needed. These dungeons can be super difficult, so expect some frustration at times dealing with everything. The bosses look pretty sweet though, and are a good but fair challenge to get past. Dying to them doesn't set you back too far, which is pretty nice, so you'll be able to beat them without too much trouble. One of the most bullshit things in this game though, is this famous code that you need to enter in to progress the story later in the game. Where do you find this code, you ask? Well, as a kid, I had no idea. This is where I initially quit. In order to figure out what this code is, you either needed to have a copy of Nintendo Power that told you, or you needed this little letter that came with the boxed game. The letter itself doesn't tell you a damn thing, instead you need to soak this bit of it in water to find a hidden code. While it may have seemed like a cute thing to do back in the day, most people, including myself, played this as a rental, so you literally could not continue the story from here unless you brute forced the password, in which you would have needed to try 746 entries before figuring it out. That's so stupid. There are some puzzles that are annoying to figure out, but at this point I'd been using a guide, so really who cares. Eventually you'll find your uncle, the angry video game nerd, that tells you the plot straight out of the Justice League, about aliens coming to Earth to find 3 magic cubes or something. Afterwards, you find and enter the alien spacecraft, and good lord, this game goes from hard to insanely hard. You have to use every bit of your focus to navigate through here while enemies shoot at you from all angles. There are warps that traverse you throughout the spaceship, which adds a puzzle element to the already spastic enemy movement. Each area somehow gets harder than the last. The best piece of advice I can give you here is to just ignore the enemies and try to run past them. Fighting them is a lost cause. At the end of the first section, there's this wild boss fight where you have to take on 2 flying robots on top of platforms, which is just about as fun as it sounds. The last area of the spaceship is the motherlode of NES hard gaming. There are 3 bosses you must defeat. The first is Zoda, the main antagonist of the game and the namesake of the StarTropics sequel. He does a bunch of random pattern attacks that are hard to dodge, but once you get the hang of it, it's not too hard to finish. The next is a core room, which drops lots of hard enemies down to attack, but there are patterns here to exploit, so if you know what you're doing, it's a pretty quick boss fight. The final area of the game is like literally the first area that allows you to farm health. Thankfully, they give you a chance here before you meet the real final boss, Zoda, this time in his sweet new looking form. This fight is absolute hell. You can only take so many hits, but touching Zoda himself is an instant death. He jumps around while shooting projectiles and these little spawns around. The only way to really beat him is to somewhat be close enough to hit him with your ranged weapons. This requires a lot of jump attacks while going between platforms, and it's really hard to master. He also takes a billion hits, so prepare to see a death screen a few times before you're able to tackle this galactic menace. Doing so is one of the most rewarding game defeats in NES in my opinion. Get some extra bonus hits in for good measure. At the end you're rewarded with this awesome finale that really ties the rest of the story up. Those 3 cubes contained Argonian children that Zoda was trying to eliminate or something. And they're definitely something. I mean, just what the hell is this guy's problem anyway? And that's StarTropics. Like, what are my final thoughts on this title? Well, it's hard to say honestly. It's one of those games that's both frustrating and pisses me off to no end at times, but it really tries to be something special and often actually succeeds in doing so. It doesn't have the crisp gameplay like Zelda has, but it has more charm and personality at the same time. The main music track is one of the most catchy on the console. The graphics are top notch, and the story is pretty great. They really went absolutely all out in these ending cutscenes as well. The main flaws of StarTropics are unfortunately the most important, and that's the controls. It's just clunky by design and not in a fun way. Also, just what were they thinking hiding that 747 code in a throwaway letter included in the packaging, or for many, behind a paywall Nintendo Power, well after they've already been playing it. What I will say is that I do have a newfound respect for StarTropics, so you're going to feel something special after completing it. For these reasons, I mean, honestly, I'll give it a very respectable 3.5 out of 5 stars.